Hi, I'm Aristotelis Pitaridis. In this video, we are going to explain how to use the data annotation attributes in our models in order to give extra information to Entity Framework about our model. Data annotation attributes introduced in .NET 3.5, and it offers a way to add validation to classes. In order to demonstrate as many as possible combinations of data annotation attributes, we are going to create two new models so that we will have a variety of different data types. We are going to have a one-to-many relationship between workers and buildings. Let's start with the worker model. We create a new class in the models folder. The first property will be the worker ID. We also add properties for the name and the surname of the worker. The next property is the salary of the worker. We also are going to include a bonus percent, which will be extra money in percentage that the worker will get if the project finishes in time. We add the date of birth of the worker. Finally, we need a time property, so we are going to add the start time, which will include the time that the worker starts every morning. The next model is the building. We create a new class in the models folder. The first property, as usual, is the building ID, which will be the primary key of the table. We are going to add one more field, which will be the name of the building. We are going to add some extra properties so that we will set up the one-to-many relationship. In the worker class, we are going to add the building ID property, which will store the building ID of the building that the worker works. We also add a virtual property for the building, which will allow us to access the information about the building the worker works. For the building model, we add a virtual property which will store a collection of workers who work in that building. First, we build the application so that we will be able to create the controller and the views for each of the models. We create the controller and the views for the building model. We also create the controller and the views for the worker model. Let's execute the application in order to store some information. First, we visit the buildings controller in order to add two buildings. Now, we visit the workers controller in order to add the worker. We type the name of the worker, the surname of the worker, the salary of the worker, the bonus, the date of birth, the start time. Here we have a problem. If we try to add a time, we will see that the system asks us to type a valid date. This happens because there is no time data type. So we use the type date time for the start time property. This means that we have to type a date as well. We are going to fix it later with the use of data annotation attributes. Finally, we select a building in which the worker works. We click the Create button and the record is stored in the database. The list is not quite friendly because the data are not displayed properly. For example, the salary has to define the currency. The bonus percent has to display the percent character. The date of birth and start time display both the date and the time, but we want the date of birth to display only the date and the start time to display only the time. Now that we have partially developed the management of the workers and buildings, let's go to the buildings controller and try to add a new building. We do not type any information in the name text box and we click the Create button. The framework is going to add a new record, and as we can see in the list, the record is empty. We have to find a way to stop the users from saving empty data or invalid data. Let's delete the empty record, because if we do not delete, we will have errors later that we will add data annotation attributes in order to test the data that the application saves. In order to see how the validation works, let's go back to the workers controller. We try to create a new record, and without typing any information, we click the Create button. The first two text boxes does not display any error message because they are just text. The same happened with the building name in the buildings controller. In the buildings controller, the system saved the empty data, but here we used some extra fields which have different data types, which does not allow us to leave them empty. In this video, we will see how to validate every field of the table in order to make sure that we will not allow the user to save invalid information to the database. Let's start by stopping the user to save empty data in the table. We open the buildings model. And over the name property, we type the required attribute. This informs the framework that we want the user to type at least one character, otherwise we'll not be able to save any data in the database. Let's see how it works. We run the application and we try to display the contents of the buildings controller. We click the Create New link in order to create a new record. We do not type any information in the text box, and we click the Create button, and we will see that this time the system will not allow us to save the data, and an error message will appear on the screen. We can change the error message by configuring the required attribute. Let's go to the buildings model and add the extra information that the attribute requires in order to define a custom error message. We set the error message property of the attribute to contain the custom error message. We type the number 0 included inside a set of curly brackets in order to define the position that we want to display the name of the field. Let's try to run the application and see the contents of the buildings controller in order to see what happened. We try to add an empty record and we will see that the error message is the one that we defined with a required attribute. We go back to the buildings model and we remove the custom error message. We go to the workers model and we add a required attribute to the name and the surname of the worker. Another problem in our form is that the labels are not displayed properly. Let's run the application and visit the workers controller. The fields bonus percent, date of birth and start time consist of at least 2 words, but because we cannot define a property with spaces, the words do not have spaces. This can be easily corrected using the display attribute. We open the worker model and we add 1 copy of the attribute in all the fields that needs correction to the text that we see on the browser. First, we add the attribute to the bonus percent property. After that, we add the attribute to the date of birth property. Finally, we add it to the start time property. We run the application and display the workers controller. We can see that the titles of the list are properly appeared on the screen. The same happens in the forms. For example, if we try to add a new worker, we will see that the labels over the text boxes are properly separate each word. Another useful attribute is the string length, which allow us to define what is the maximum and minimum length of the string that we are going to type. Let's open the worker model in order to use the string length attribute. We type the attribute string length using a parameter with a value of 30, which says to the system that the user cannot save a value with more than 30 characters. As requires attribute does, the string length attribute allows us to define a custom string, which will be used as an error message. We can also define the minimum number of characters that a user can type. Let's see the same attribute for the surname by defining the minimum length to be equal to 5 characters. We can make it by defining a value for the minimum length property. Let's run the application to see the workers controller in action. We try to add a new worker by clicking the Create New link. Now, if we try to type a short surname, we will see that the error message appears again because we define the minimum length in the string length attribute. Now, we try to type a longer surname. We will see that an error message appears again. If we type a string with a proper length, the application will remove the error message. In case that we want to define the data type of the field, we can use the data type attribute. This is useful in our example in order to define that the date of birth is not a date time, but it is date, and the start time is not a date time, but it is time. We open the worker model and we add the attribute to the two properties. Let's run the application again in order to see the result. We display the controller workers and we will see that the date and time in the list appears as it is supposed to appear. The same happens when we display the details page of the worker. If we try to create a new worker, we will see that the date and time fields allow us to display extra controls in order to make the data input easier. There is a small problem when we try to edit an existing record, but we will fix it. When we edit a worker, the date and time field loses their values. In order to fix it, we use the display format attribute. Let's run the application again to see if the edit form works as it is supposed to work. Now the edit form works properly and the text boxes display the already saved values. Another thing that we have to fix is that we have to format the appearance of the salary and the bonus percent values. The first has to finish with the currency symbol and the second has to finish with a percentage character. In order to fix this problem, we are going to use the display format attribute. The syntax is similar with the one that we used for the date and time. The only difference is that we do not want the extra characters to appear in the text box, so we set the apply format in edit mode to be equal to false. Now we can run the application to see the result. The change is not applied only in the list, but we can see the same result in the details page. Another problem that we may meet is that we do not restrict the user to type values for the numbers, dates and times within a predefined range. For this problem, we have to use the range attribute, which allows us to define an upper and lower range for the values that we type. The use of the attribute in numbers is very simple. For example, let's allow the bonus percent to have values between 0 and 20. In order to apply the range attribute to the date of birth, we have to define also the type of the values that define the range. If we want to combine multiple attributes in one line, we can separate them using the comma character. Let's apply it in the name field. We combine the required and the string length attributes into one line. I think that using a different line for each attribute is easier to read, but some people want to decrease the number of lines of code, so this is the solution. There are some more attributes which allow us to give information about the structure of the tables that the entity framework will use for our application. Let's start from the attribute which defines the uniqueness of a record. In order to inform entity framework that a model property is a primary key, we can use the key attribute. Let's use it for the worker ID property of the worker model. Let's use it for the building ID property of the building model as well. By default, Entity Framework will identify for us the primary key of the model, but it is good to use the key attribute so that we will ensure that Entity Framework will use the right property as a primary key. When we have relationships between models, we can inform Entity Framework which is the foreign key of the model. In order to make it, we can use the foreign key attribute. In the worker model, our foreign key is the building ID property. So let's add the foreign key attribute to that property. This attribute is very useful when the foreign key has not the same name with the equivalent primary key of the associated model. Sometimes we want the model property name and the table field that Entity Framework is going to create to have different names. This can be done using the column attribute. Let's see how to use it. Let's ask Entity Framework to use a different name for the name property of the worker model. We suppose that we want to use the first name as field's name. Then we have to add the column attribute to the name property. The same can happen with the name of the model. We can define a different name to be used in the database by Entity Framework. In order to make it, we can use the table attribute. Let's try to define a different name for the buildings table. We are going to rename the table and give it the name Company Buildings. One more very useful attribute is the not mapped attribute, which allows us to create model properties which will be used by the Entity Framework in order to create a table field. This is very useful if we want to store data which change every time and we have to make new calculations in order to have its values. For example, if we want to have the age information for the worker, we cannot store it in the database because it changes every time that the worker is 1 year older. But the database cannot know it. This means that every time that we load the worker, we can calculate the age of the worker and we can use this information as many times as we want because we have stored it as a property in our model. Let's add the new property in our workers model. Because we used the not mapped attribute, this property is not going to be used in order to create a database field in the database. Initially, it will have the value 0. And we can calculate the age in the action and we will be able to display the value in the view.